Welcome, friends. We're glad you've chosen to be with us today as we continue our study of the book of Galatians. We're glad that you're here, that you are here with us by watching from the privacy of your home or wherever it may be, as we together open the book we call the Bible and study those edicts and things that came from God. The Apostle Paul was God's chosen apostle to the Gentiles. And one of the things he had to struggle with as he set forth the gospel to the Gentiles was that so many of those that were Jews that had become Christians wanted to make Christianity just an addition to the law of Moses, and that it was never God's will. The book of Galatians, as we have shown, is that it intends to show that the law that was given by Moses was only a tutor to bring these individuals to Christ. It was a steward over a minor child to be over him, to guard him until the time that the Father had set, when it would be that he entered into his majority and he could now make decisions on his own. And when that law had brought that child to the schoolroom and brought that minor child to the place of adulthood where he entered into his inheritance, that law ended. And then the new covenant was that began. And as Paul gives argument after argument showing the truth of those statements, there is this final argument that he makes in the book of Galatians, which is very telling. And it is an allegory, a story in which that different things of things that actually were events in life were made to stand for things that were spiritual. And what he chooses to use is a story, an allegory of Abraham and his two sons. So I'm reading now from the book of Galatians, the 4th chapter. And the writer says this, "Tell me, ye that desire to be under the law, do you not hear the law? It's written that Abraham had two sons, one by the handmaid and one by the freewoman. Howbeit, the son by the handmaid was born after the flesh, but the son by the freewoman is born through promise, which things contain an allegory. For these women are two covenants, one bearing children under bondage, which is Hagar. Now this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and answereth to Jerusalem that now is, for she's in bondage with her children. But the Jerusalem which is above is free, which is our mother. For it's written, Rejoice, thou barren that bearest not, break forth and cry, thou that travailest not. But more are the children of the desolate than of her that hath the husband. Now we, brethren, as Isaac was, are children of promise. But as then he that was born after the flesh persecuted him that was born through the Spirit, so also it is now. Howbeit, what saith the Scripture? Cast out the handmaid and her son, for the son of the handmaid shall not inherit with the son of the freewoman." Now, when we look at this, we see an allegory. These women actually lived. These sons actually lived. The events that the apostle makes allusion to was an event that actually occurred. It is written that Abraham had two sons. Well, actually, Abraham had more than two sons. He had, after Sarah died, children by a woman that he married by the name of Keturah. But that does not fit into the situation that existed between these two sons. Abraham had promised, or had been promised by God, that if he would leave his country and go to a land that God would show him, he would make of him a great nation. He would bless him, multiply his seed, and he would give to that nation a land, and then ultimately, through the seed of Abraham, all the families of the earth would be blessed. God never intended that any heir should be Abraham's heir, save the seed that was the result of the union between him and his wife Sarah. But Sarah was barren. For many, many years she went and she bore no child, a measure of great disappointment both to her and to Abraham. Ultimately, Sarah suggested to Abraham, I have a handmaid. Her name is Hagar. Take her, and by proxy perhaps I can have a child through her. And so Abraham took as a concubine this woman, Hagar. A child was born. That child was Ishmael. And thus Ishmael, had he been the only heir of Abraham, would have been his heir apparent. But God hadn't intended that. God intended that a child of Abraham and Sarah should be his heir. And so as the years went by, then God spoke to Abraham again. Abraham was 100 years old. Sarah was 90 years old. God promised and brought forth to fulfillment that promised child called Isaac. Ishmael was the first son. He was about 13 years old. And in the process of time, when it was that Isaac was born, he was no longer heir apparent. And when it was that Isaac grew up, matured to the point that he was to be weaned, Abraham rejoiced, made a great feast for it. And Ishmael mocked. And Sarah saw Ishmael mocking, and it angered her. And she said to Abraham, cast out this woman and her son, for that woman's son shall not inherit with my son. And so it was. Now, as we look at this allegory, we see two women. We see two sons. And we see that Paul said these women are something. Hagar is that answers to Mount Sinai. She stands for the law that Moses gave. And her son, Hagar, stands for the physical Jew. And the record says that he was born after the flesh. That is, there were no promises connected with his birth. But now we look, on the other hand, at Sarah. And Sarah was the free woman, and her son was that was one that was the Christian, that was the one that was the heir of God's promise to Abraham before he ever had children at all. We look at these two then, and we see two covenants. We see the law of Moses, and we see the gospel of Jesus Christ and the covenant. One is called the first covenant, the other is called the second covenant. Hagar, the bondwoman, was one that stood for that first covenant. Sarah, the free woman, stood for the second covenant. And then we find that Hagar stood for Jerusalem, physical Jerusalem. Her son stood for physical Jews. But Sarah stood for spiritual Jerusalem. She stood for the second covenant, and she stood for that, and her son stood for those that were heirs of that second covenant, the Christian. Then the record says that as then he that was born after the flesh persecuted him that was born after the Spirit. What Paul is speaking about is that time at the weaning of Isaac, which Ishmael mocked and laughed at this, his half-brother. But Sarah saw it, and mother that she was jealous. And so she said to Abraham, you cast out this woman and her son. Now, he says, as then, so it is now, as the son of the flesh persecuted him that was born after the Spirit, so also it is now. What Paul meant was that the physical Jew was one that persecuted in that first century the spiritual Jew. And we look and find that was precisely the truth. Persecutions began soon after the church was begun. First mild, then stronger, and ultimately the taste of blood was that was accomplished in Acts 7 when Stephen was stoned to death. And Paul was there aware of that and agreeing with what was done. So then he says that he that was born after the flesh persecuted him that was born after the Spirit. So also it's now. The physical Jew was persecuting the spiritual Jew. But then he says, howbeit, what saith the Scriptures? Cast out the handmaid and her son. For the son of the handmaid shall not inherit with the son of the free woman. Now, friends, this command of Sarah, this demand of Sarah to her husband, was something that was very hurtful to Abraham. He was devastated. He loved Ishmael. He didn't want to cast this son out. It was only because God says, you fulfill her request. But God promised him and consoled him by saying, I will make of Ishmael, I will make of him a great nation. But God said, Isaac is the seed I promised to you long ago. And he is the one that will be the one through whom all the blessings of the earth, all the blessings, spiritual blessings will be found. And as we look, we make some observations in regard to that. When we look, recognize, friends, that these two sons could not exist together. These two women could not exist together. They had to be ones that were separated. And the truth is, my friends, that those who try to keep the law today, any part of it, is that is doing something that is impossible. The two do not coexist together. When the new covenant began, the old covenant ended. And someone says, well, what about the Jew today? Isn't the Jew God's chosen favorite people? Aren't they favored in his sight? My friend, the physical Jew today is loved by God. But the real Jew today is not the one that's physically so. The real Jew today is the one that is spiritually so, one that is the heir and the descendant of the new covenant, the Christian. Well, then, can the Jew not be saved? Well, certainly the Jew can be saved, but he's going to be saved the same way that the Gentile is saved. Remember what Jesus said. Jesus said, I am the way. I am the truth. I am the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. There is one way, and that way is Jesus. If the Gentile is going to be saved, what does he have to do? He has to go in by Jesus. Suppose the Gentile doesn't hear Jesus. He'd be lost. Well, what about the Jew? Can he be saved? Yes, but he'll have to go the same way that the Gentile goes in. He'll have to go by the way of Jesus Christ. He'll have to make the same confession that Peter made, that the eunuch made. I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. He will have to become a Christian, be one that is an adherent of the new covenant. He can be saved, and Jesus teaches that he can, but not because he's physically a Jew. That first covenant was done away. The new covenant is that stands today. And the record says that was needful, because the Hebrew writer said if that first covenant had been faultless, then would no place have been found and sought for a second. For God found fault with them and gave the new covenant. And while we know that the law of God is perfect, there was fault in the first covenant. And the fault in the first covenant was it could not forgive sins, friend. There was no forgiveness, complete, permanent forgiveness of sin under the first covenant. There is under the second covenant. We can be grateful and thankful that God sent his Son to die for us. And we can be thankful that this promise was made to mankind for almost 4,000 years ago. For God made this promise to Abraham, in your seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. We'll continue our study as we look at chapter 5 of Galatians and our study next week. We hope you'll join us then, that you'll study ahead of time, read, meditate, and be thankful that God is above and that he's given you the blessings that he has and that he's given you the grace that he has. Thank you, and a good day to you.